welcome to the Fan of History. I am the Fan of History, and this is it, guys. This is the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It's the 910s BC. I'm just a fan of history. My sources are vague, but they are quickly getting better, because now the Assyrians are a very good source for what's going on. Maybe not yet. Maybe in the days of Ashur-Dan, but very soon we will have extensive records of a lot of things, most of them nasty, from the Assyrians. Please watch the Great Civilizations of the World in 1000 BC to see the stage in which the Neo-Assyrian Empire rises. But before we talk about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we have to mention the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans are important because they will influence events for the coming 100 years. And if you want proof of that, Nebuchadnezzar, you might have heard of him. I bet every you has heard of him, if no one else. He was a Chaldean. The Chaldeans arrive in the Middle East along with the Armenians and harass people. They are barbarians, they're raiders, but they take this area. This map is from the 6th century BC, so ignore the other things, but they take this area close to the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, where we have marches. So they take this area that was not heavily populated. The area is called the Mat-Kaidi by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, the land of the Chaldeans. But from this area, the three major tribes, of which Bit Yakin is the biggest ones, and note that the names of the centers of the Chaldean tribes are named Bit something, just like the Armenians' population centers. So they might even be Armenians, but they call themselves Chaldeans. And they have a very, very complex relationship to Babylon, which is located there. So they are almost in Babylon, and these marches formally belong to Babylon. The marches are also the main trade route to Elam, this country here, from Babylon. And now the Chaldeans will control it. After the fall of the Babylonian Empire, far in the future now, Chaldean will come to mean magic, mysterious, or witchcraft. And the Bible is notorious for using the word Chaldean to mean Babylonian, because Babylonian and Chaldean will become the same thing later. But know this, there is a warlike tribe inhabiting the marches south of Babylon, because they will enter the narrative later. But now let's talk about the main actor of the coming 30 plus episodes, the Assyrians. What is happening in Assyria in 920? Well, we are at the end of Ashur-Dan II's final his reign. Yearly he has campaigned to honor Ashur, the god of war, and this we don't have pictures of these early kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, so I'm gonna use different pictures of Ashur, the god of war, flying around with his little wings, killing everybody, the most nasty and cruel god in the world. Ashudan is still training the army, building roads, building iron weapons, recruiting new warriors. But the enemies that forced Assyria to lose their empire in the 11th and 12th century, they will now taste the steel of Ashur, because they are weak and Assyria has grown strong. But before we look into that, we have to see who these enemies were. So we walk around Assyria and see who their neighbors are. To the north, they have the tribes of Nairi around Lake Van. This is Lake Van. And this area will become the center of the kingdom of Urartu, which will be one of the main enemies of Assyria. But here is Assyria. So Assyria is very close there. This is a rich region and one of the main targets of the Assyrian yearly robber campaigns. Because at this early stage of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the campaigns are yearly, beginning after the harvest is indoors, and then you can attack somebody and take their stuff, or take their tribute if they're willing to pay. And this is what the Assyrians will be doing soon. To the north, we have the enormous steppes. And the Assyrians are well aware of the people of the steppes. You remember the Cimmerians? The Cimmerians are on the steppes, and they are not Conan. There are also the Scythians, and there are other people, horse people of the steppes. And they have horses, and the Assyrians love horses. And we will see the Neo-Assyrian Empire constructing enormous schemes for stealing the horses from the horsemen of the steppes, or buying the horses, or getting the horses any way they can. The horses will be one of the main weapons of Assyria, but they don't have horses in Assyria the same way the steppes do. So we will see the Assyrians and how they steal the horses of the horse lords. To the west is the main target of the Assyrian Empire. We have the Neo-Hittites and the Armenians. In this picture it looks like Aram is a kingdom, but it isn't. It's extremely divided. Remember the Neo-Hittites? They remember the Hittite Empire that is long gone now. And they are rich, and they have merged with the Armenians. So we have a lot of small, very rich cities that have forgotten their warlike ways. So they are the prime targets for Assyria. And Damascus will rise soon to become the focus of resistance against Assyria. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. To the south of Assyria we have Babylon. And Babylon is weak. We saw earlier the Chaldeans are harassing Babylon from the south. And for some reason, as I said in the show about Assyrian history from 3000 BC to 1000 BC, the Assyrians have a lot of respect for Babylon. They have a lot of respect for Marduk, the main god of the Babylonians. He is like the second best god in the world after Ashur, the god of war. We'll talk a lot more about that. Actually, the biggest relationship Assyria will have, and that it will eventually lead to Assyria's downfall, is its relationship with Babylon, despite the fact that they will once erase Babylon from the map. To the southeast we have the mysterious kingdom of Elam. It is as ancient as Sumer, and we don't know anything about Elam in this period. Remember, there was a king earlier in this century that came from Elam and took over Babylon. He's long gone, and we don't know anything about Elam, except that Elam is keeping the very fertile Elam area out of the hands of the people of the Zagros Mountains, these tribes here. So the enemies to the east are the mountain tribes of the Zagros Mountains. Many tribes come from these areas. Most of them are Indo-European in origin. The Persian, Medes and Parthians will all come from this area. And the Manians will be the first to control the Zagros Mountains and Iran then as a kingdom, but that will not happen until 850 BC. Right now the area is very disorganized, but they have horses that they've taken from the steppes. So the Assyrians will steal their horses, will recruit these fierce mountain warriors to fight for the Assyrian army. Remember, the only thing it takes to be an Assyrian is that you worship Ashur, you march with the Assyrian army, you obey the Assyrian king. So the Assyrians will accept foreign people into their armies. And right now is the time to get on board. In 920 BC, Shamash-Mudamik becomes the king of Babylon. He succeeds Mar-Biti-Aedina, who has had an enormous long reign of which we know very little. We don't know a lot about Shamash-Mudamik either. His ancestry is unknown, and the only source we have for him that's reliable is the Assyrians. He has chosen a really bad time to become the ruler of Babylon. We don't have a picture of him, so here's Marduk, the god of Babylon, the one that the Assyrians respect. But Shamash-Mudamik will turn out to be a very efficient ruler. His situation is super bad. Babylon is weak, the Chaldeans are in the south, and the Assyrian Empire is rising in the north. But we will see what Shamash-Mudamik can do with this. In 912 BC, Ashur-Dan II dies. And I like to imagine what he's saying on his deathbed to his son Adad-Nirari. That I set this empire for you, son. I built these armies, I built this road, I built these aqueducts. I built everything, and now you can go ahead. Ashur is surely pleased with Ashur-Dan's life, and Assyria is now ready. But hey, so he dies in 912 BC, and the Assyrian Empire begins in 911 BC. In 912 BC there appears to be an Assyrian civil war. Very little is known about this civil war, and here's another picture of Ashur, the god of war. Adad-Nirari II will be the winner of this civil war, and he claims to be the eldest son and the legitimate successor of Ashur-Dan II. But the Assyrians are notorious for changing history, and we don't know at all what happened. I read somewhere there was a possible revolt among the vassals of Assyria, but who are the vassals of Assyria? They don't seem to have too many vassals yet, so we don't know really what happened in 912 BC, but something happened. And in 911 BC, Adad-Nirari II, traditionally counted as the first king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, takes power in Ashur. He will reign until 891 BC. He's the grandfather of Ashur-Dan II. And Ashur-Dan II is the first great king of Neo-Assyria. Some people consider Ashur-Dan II the true founder of the empire. The rise of Adad-Nirari II is a special event in that it is the first event in world history, in ancient Near Eastern history, that is reliably dated. It turns out that the Assyrians were astronomers. They are traders, they are scientists. We will learn a lot more about the Assyrians. They are not mindless, violent empire builders, but they are actually a great civilization in every way. So their astronomical observations and their king's list, etc., makes this event the most reliable dated event in Near Eastern history. More reliable than anything in Egypt, in fact. So what does Adad-Nirari II do? Well, Ashur tells him you have to go forth every year and beat somebody up and take their stuff. And so he does. Later in the Neo-Assyrian Empire we will pretty much have a record of who is getting beaten up every year and where the king goes. But we don't have that yet. So I found this map. It is unreliable. See, there are mythical kings of Israel on it, for example. But this is interesting. The Battle of 910. So let's go there. In 910 BC, Adad-Nirari campaigns against the Armenians. These are Armenian tribes at the junction of the Kabur and Euphrates River. Is this big thing here. And this actually happens in 908 or 902. We'll talk about that next episode. But here there is a big fight between Assyria and the Armenians, and this area is conquered by Assyria. So it becomes part of Assyria, and this is something entirely new. There has been yearly campaigns before this, but Assyria has not taken territory since the Middle Assyrian Empire, and now they do. They also begin already here the policy of deporting, the policy which Nebuchadnezzar will use against the Jews in the 6th century. So to secure control of an area, Assyria takes the population and moves it somewhere else in Assyria. Many of the men of the Arameans were assimilated into the army of the Assyrians, but women, old people, etc., they're not killed and slaughtered yet, but they are forced to work for the Assyrians in another part of Assyria, possibly the north. So this is one way the empire is growing, and that is also one way that will be borrowed by the Romans and the Persians at later stages. So why do the Assyrians have such a bad reputation? Until the 19th century we didn't know anything about the Assyrian Empire but what the Bible tells us. And in fact it turns out that what the Bible tells us in the Old Testament about Assyria is very reliable. When we found the Assyrians' own records in the 19th century, now stolen by the British and put in the British Museum, we confirmed a lot of what was said in the Bible. But, okay, the Bible really disliked the Assyrians and the Babylonians, but it turns out the Bible was not entirely wrong, and there are aspects of the Assyrian Empire that cannot be described as anything else but purely evil, and we'll get back to those. I will have some very, very nasty things to tell you about. But this is the beginning of all things empire. There are so many things that you now think are Persian or Roman, Look at this. It's one of the first aqueducts. It's an Assyrian aqueduct because the Assyrians invented aqueducts, at least in large scale. You will be surprised at how many things you consider empire. You see, I already told you about them building military roads to travel quickly to different places, just like the Romans. People usually think that the Romans might have borrowed things from the Persians, or the Greeks borrowed them and then the Romans borrowed them. But in fact, most things come from the Assyrian Empire. And in fact, the Persians, when they take over, will really change only one thing, and that is they will be far nicer to subject people than the Assyrians. But more about that when we come to Ashur-Nassir-Pal. In this episode, I will not talk about all the other places. We have very poor sources for the 910s. And it will just be, we don't know what happened there, we don't know what happened there. We can mention that we know that Osirkon I rules Egypt, and that then King Gong rules the Zhou dynasty in China. But there's not much else to say about the 910s. But I promised you more on the Bantu expansion. So you will have more on that. The Bantu expansion begins about 1000 BC. It originates in Cameroon and eastern Nigeria, and it coincides with the Nok culture going on in Nigeria. I might mention the Nok later if you're interested. We don't know a lot about them. The expansion will go on until 300 AD, and this is very bad news for the Khoisan people that we discussed in last episode. The one possible cause listed for the Bantu expansion is agriculture. That they had agriculture and the other people to the south did not. They do not have iron until 400 BC, and they don't really have a great state until 1400 AD with the kingdom of Mutapa. Or maybe they were responsible for Great Zimbabwe, which happens in 1000 AD, and that is far outside the scope of Fan of History. I will probably never get that far into the future. So the next episode will talk about the events of 909 to 900 BC. I will give you a short summary of the 10th century BC, and we will watch when Babylon and Assyria goes to war against each other for the very first time in the era of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. But that will happen again and again and again. Next episode will air on Fan of History on YouTube on May the 19th. And 300 years of war has now begun. Aha. You can discuss the show with me on Facebook. And you can like it here on YouTube. You can tweet at me at Fan of History. Please subscribe, like and share. Like this on Facebook. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, because that's what helps me going. I am going to do over 30 episodes on the Neo-Assyrian Empire. I'm going down to... Actually, I only promised 800 BC, but I will probably not be able to contain myself. So unless this fails miserably, I will keep going until the fall of Nineveh, because of the fall of the Neo-Assyrian Empire is so spectacular. It's one of the great events of world history. So, but I have a lot to tell you about the Neo-Assyrian Empire, so stay tuned to Fan of History. And thank you for watching.